The Game Boy has had plenty of success with arcade ports in the past. Titles like Galaga and Galaxian, Centipede, and Dig Dug were straightforward, safe, non-flashy ports that didn't demand much except faithfulness, featured simple, straightforward controls, and could often comfortably stick to a single screen. Graphical downgrades to the monochrome was not really a problem. Of course, stuff like Super Breakout and the original DMG version of PacMan showed you still had to be a bit careful because it could still go wrong. Moving up to the advanced console, and the nostalgia factor for these golden era arcade classics certainly hadn't gone away, and could still shift cartridges, and the new system allowed for ports that much more accurately represented how the games were originally. Full color and higher resolution, plus better sound obviously, and more options for controls. Not that they were often needed for these. What might have been cool was if the wider screen could somehow have been turned on its end, so you could have had a taller playfield like they did in Galaga for instance, but unlike the Atari Lynx or the WonderSwan, the GBA's buttons don't comfortably allow for that. Namco are one of the biggest names from the arcade era, so there's tons of scope to choose from. That's already evidenced by the existence of 3 Namco Gallery compilations that came out in Japan for the original Game Boy. We have 5 of Namco's most famous arcade games on one cart here, which is magnificent value for money. First up is Galaga, one of the earliest and most influential shoot-em-ups in history. Over single-screen waves blast away at swarms of aliens that just keep coming. Unlike Space Invaders, the horde isn't gradually descending towards you, but periodically some alien craft will break off from the formation and dive attack you in a specific movement pattern before rejoining the ranks. You can also be captured by the boss Galaga and sucked up in its tractor beam. Apart from the screen dimensions, this version is as faithful a port as I think I've ever seen. The ship feels immediately familiar to control, and the reload weapon of the time is the usual, slightly less quick than you want it to be, but equally totally fair. The colors are vibrant and the music and other SFX are very retro sounding. Galaxian, the predecessor to Galaga, is a slightly more primitive game, but otherwise very similar and still a very accurate replication. It wasn't shown on the box art for some reason. The gameplay's a little less sophisticated with no real variation in wave pattern each stage, but you can't really have Galaga without Galaxian, as we saw with the old arcade classic Volume 3. Dig Dug is decent, but as it happens I actually prefer the older Game Boy version. This one is a bit too easy and the levels don't change up very much. The new Dig Dug mode in that older one was a nice alternative to the gameplay, and the difficulty curve was better measured. Miss Pac-Man is essentially the same as Pac-Man, except she's wearing a bow and lipstick. Conversely to Dig Dug, this version is massively better than the Game Boy Pac-Man, which is kinda buggy and also looks terrible. Here, the control is smooth and responsive and, dare I say, actually fun. Yeah, a really good port. Finally, Pole Position rounds out the cartridge and is quite different visually to all the others. This 3D-ish racing game has some rather impressive graphics. They were, especially for the time, and still look good in this 2001 version. You'll need to switch between low and high gears to get the most out of the car, but bear in mind you need to switch back to low either at the end of a race or at the start of the next one, because oddly, if you end any session in high gear, you'll still be in it at the start of the next one. I don't really like how the car controls. It was never my favourite racing game. It takes a lot to get used to the slipperiness if you're accustomed to normal D-pad races. However, the original arcade version was controlled using a massive steering wheel, so it's meant to replicate that, I suppose. Quite playable once you practice a bit, although only having the one track was always a bit of a shame. All in all, quite an impressive collection of classic arcade games. Galaga in particular is a really good version, one of the best I've played actually. If you have any nostalgia or even a fleeting interest in these games, Namco Museum is super successful in what it tries to do.